Tom, we've made some memories the last couple days.
Yes, we have.
We hosted our first boot camp on the American Idea.
Yep.
And we have been...
It was awesome.
It was such a great time. We did it at the Monarch Casino up in Black Hawk, Colorado.
Yep.
There was actually, surprisingly, I was relatively surprised how little gambling actually went on.
I was too.
Over the course of the weekend. We were at a casino. You'd think a lot of people wanted to go down and do it. And yet we had this absolutely awesome suite that we were hanging out in.
We were up in the, what was it called?
It was called the Penthouse Sky Suite.
Yeah.
21 floors up in the mountains with some of those gorgeous views you could imagine.
Somebody made a reference. What was that comedy movie?
The Hangover.
The Hangover. It was that kind of suite.
We did get a couple questions. Is there a tiger in the bathroom?
Yeah.
And some of those memories were made,
So we'll just say this, Dave. Some people might have been driving scooters up and down the hallway.
Yeah.
Some people might have even crashed them, maybe. But won't name any names.
We also...
Somebody might have spilled some wine all over their shirt and maybe got that shirt autographed later in the evening.
Somebody might have paid to get that shirt autographed. That's right. The memories you want to keep forever.
Yeah.
So it was great. Another comment that came up on a slightly more serious side, but another comment came up. We actually saw, in maybe its most pure form, true market capitalism at work. For years that I've been seeing casinos and been on casino floors, you go around the blackjack tables and there's a little sign on the blackjack table that says what the table minimum is and what the table maximum bet is, right? So it might be $5, it might be $20. What's the minimum amount you have to bet to sit down at that table?
Yep.
That bet usually drives demand. Mm-hmm. What we saw recently, the Monarch has been recently totally redone. I think it reopened last November. So
we should add here for people who don't know. I mean, I was new. I'd never been there before, even though it's, 25 miles from Denver. I'd never been there. And it's kind of weird and cool all at the same time. Black Hawk, Colorado is this tiny little town nestled in the mountains. And you come in a 2-lane, windy, mountainous road. And it's like a mini Las Vegas.
Right.
All lit up, these big, gigantic, 20, 25-story hotels, and they all have casinos attached to them. Black Hawk, within the city limits, gambling is limited, or gambling is permitted by law, and that's the action there. And so you have all these casinos, and some of them have built some fabulous big hotels attached to them, and that's where we did our weekend retreat.
There were two elements that showed the idea of free market capitalism to me. The first was that there are two major hotels in Black Hawk. I mean, there's a lot of other hotels. There's small hotels, there's motels, there are casinos without rooms to stay.
Right.
But there are two major hotels. There's the Ameristar, which I believe is owned by Penn Gaming. Okay. Penn Gaming owns the Tropicana in Vegas, among dozens of other casino hotels across the country. And then you have the Monarch, which has one sister property, the Atlantis Resort in Reno, Nevada, which I've heard is absolutely spectacular also. But because of the fears of COVID and everything that's been going on, the Ameristar has closed their buffet temporarily, right? There's a fear of well, what if we serve food and there's people reaching in and taking from the buffet?
And that's kind of a thing with gambling, right? Like, I have not gambled much in my life, but casinos, gambling, and buffets, all kind of, it's sort of like country music and cowboy hats, right? Like it just kind of fits together.
In Vegas, the buffets at the casinos, right? That's one of their ways of drawing you in. They have a relatively reasonably priced buffet that has some of the best steak and prime rib and crab legs and lobster and like the best food, right? It's all about indulgence at a casino, right? So right now, the Monarch is really the only casino with a big buffet that is open. So what I've been told and what we observed is the foot traffic at the Monarch is significantly higher than all of the other casinos right now.
They have the buffet.
They have the buffet, and people will admittedly say that's the reason that they are going there.
Yep.
They have more food options. They have the buffet. So obviously that drives more traffic. That also affects different things. It affects prices of rooms. Their room prices right now are a little bit higher than the Ameristar for that purpose. They have more demand. But going back to the blackjack tables, and this was really interesting to me. So with their remodel, one of the things they did, and I think they've been doing this in Vegas for a little while. I don't think this is new. But the blackjack tables had those signs that said what your minimum and maximum bets were.
Yeah.
For the first time, I noticed they were digital. So as opposed to just being a regular sign that says the minimum bet so
the number could change,
correct.
the amount could change,
and nobody had to go change it. Right? Sometimes you'd see a pit boss in the old way. Pit boss would walk over and take out the sign and put in another one. Now they could change it from a central computer at any time. You could have 6 people sitting around a table, and all of a sudden it flashes, and that number goes from $25 to $50 as a minimum bet, and it's all based on your demand for the table. They have what they call the eye in the sky, right? Those cameras that are watching over every table.
Yeah.
And if they start to see people congregating behind, waiting for those seats to open up, they'll clear out seats. They want higher bidders, right? They want the bets to be higher. That's how the casinos make a lot more money. So they will raise the minimum to clear out the people who are trying to bet less and see who's willing to stick around. If there's not enough people to fill the table, they need more bettors too. So if there's not enough people to fill the table, they'll lower it back down. So I was walking through the casino on Thursday afternoon. It's kind of taking in, getting a lay of the land.
Yeah.
And there were plenty of blackjack tables with a $5 minimum bet, right?
Did you go plunk down some money, Dave?
I did not. I didn't place a single bet the whole weekend.
I didn't either.
There were a lot of $5 tables. When we walked down there on Friday night, there were 2 tables that had a minimum of $25, and that was the smallest table. Most of the tables were $50 to $100 minimum bet. I mean, think about that. $100 minimum bet.
And when we went down there, it was full.
It was packed.
Yeah, there were a lot of people there. Yep.
So
Makes sense.
They're drawing people in. They're getting higher. They're getting more foot traffic because of this buffet.
Then they can charge more for the blackjack tables.
And that lets them raise up the stakes on the blackjack tables.
Yeah, it's funny. That was, one of the basic lessons, trying to get students to understand that demand drives the price. One of the examples, and it's related to this, I used to use the example of most restaurants have a lunch menu and a dinner menu. And typically, items on the lunch menu are less expensive, even items that are exactly the same. And I would ask students, so what's the difference? You're talking about the same restaurant, the same food, the same people preparing it.
Usually a similar proportion. I mean, sometimes you have bigger dinner portions, but not often.
Everything's basically the same. What's the big difference? And the difference is most restaurants, there are fewer people there for lunch. The demand's just much lower. Whereas more people want to, go out in the evening, go have dinner, go have a drink. There's more people in the evening. The demand's higher, so you can charge more for the exact same meal that you can at lunch when demand's lower.
Think about the game you can kind of play with that. It almost goes back to, and I say game intentionally. I took a class in college on John Nash's game theory.
Okay.
And it was actually pretty interesting. The class itself was how game theory applies to how Congress makes its decisions and how they can all get to a point where we can get a majority vote on something. I would really love to retake that class now, knowing how Congress is acting today, whereas it was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
But that whole game within a restaurant of what are higher profit margin items, and if I opened a restaurant, I would actually take a different tact than there's a higher demand for dinner. I would say there's also more competition for people going out to dinner.
Right.
I'm going to make my food costs lower. I'm going to lower my margins on food costs because alcohol is where you make the money.
Yeah.
And people are more willing to drink at night.
Yep.
So if I can get people in to say, because my plate of spaghetti is $12, whereas the other Italian restaurant down the street is $20.
Yep.
But I can get somebody to drink 2 or 3 glasses of red wine here at mine, whereas at theirs they're saying, I just spent $20 on a bowl of spaghetti. I'm only going to have 1 glass of wine tonight.
It's absolutely true.
And all of a sudden, you're playing. There's a whole game to this.
Well, I wasn't I wasn't planning on going down this path, but we are talking about, the theme today is money, spending, all related things. One of the interesting experiences I had in graduate school, so there I am working on my PhD in political science, and my emphasis was political philosophy.
Right.
So I'm reading the Greeks and the Romans and the Federalist Papers and things like that. And I went to a week-long seminar at the University of Arizona. A guy who runs it, I don't know if he's still around in Arizona or not. His name was Vernon Smith. He was a Nobel laureate economist who really, he didn't invent, but he really helped to pioneer and develop the realm of experimental economics, conducting real life experiments and then collecting the data and see what would happen. So we sat in some seminars and they had a big room set up with all these computer terminals. That's where we do the experiments. So this would be a kind of real experiment. Part of the room are sellers of electricity. They're going to sell it. And they're given certain criteria. It costs so much money to produce, to generate and distribute so many, I don't even know how electricity is measured. Was it megawatts, something like that?
Something like that. Kilowatts.
The point is they're selling electricity and they have a cost. So if they can sell it for more than their cost, the guys running the experiment actually pay them cash. These experiments would go on for maybe an hour, maybe 90 minutes. Their interest is in trying to sell for more than their cost.
Okay.
The other people in the room are buyers. You're in a house and there's criteria on you. The temperature's getting cold. You got to turn your heater on, for example, and things like this. And you want to buy electricity, buy energy lower than what your costs are. And you're going back, everybody's making offers, right? So some of the producers say, hey, we have power to sell for, $1 million per unit. Well, nobody wants to buy that. The buyers say, I'll offer you a penny, right, for 1 million units of energy. No producers will accept that. And they keep changing, but also nobody's making any money in this experiment because they're not completing a sale.
And the people trying to buy electricity are cold.
That's right. And so they keep going and what happens is the people buying keep raising their prices, the people selling keep low, and eventually they hit an equilibrium. And then when the experiment is over, and people would walk away, we were graduate students, and people would walk away from a 90-minute experiment with $300-400 in their pocket. So it was enough money that people took it seriously. They weren't just, joking around. And then they would put all of the offers and the successful transactions that actually happened, and we'd map it out. And it was really fascinating to see how all these offers would get closer and closer and closer until it would form a line. And there would be the equilibrium price. And so it just showed you, and then they would do different experiments controlling how much information. Economists will often talk about markets as kinds of auctions. And within any kind of auction, the person selling, right, there are different ways to make different amounts of information known. There are different things that can be known to the person selling. The person buying can know different amounts of information, different expectations. And so we went through all these different models of buyers and sellers knowing different amounts of information and then looking at how that results in the equilibrium price. It was quite fascinating.
If I was in that class, I would have gone to the professor and said, can I start selling blankets? I mean, right? Because then you start thinking about, well, what's the difference? Do I want to buy something one time where it might cost me a little bit more than 1 kilowatt of energy, but it lasts me forever?
Right.
Versus do I want to keep paying this person on and on and on and on for the rest of my life?
Yep.
What you were just describing, I mean, that's the stock market.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that is the market. You have market makers on every stock or on all of these categories, and they're sitting there and they're looking at all the people wanting to buy and all the people wanting to sell, and you see these charts. You say, well, I'm willing to pay this. Somebody says, I'm looking for this. Okay.
Right.
Let's match up and trade. And that's why it's called stock trading, not...
Well, you're right. And, and the guys running this, I mean, these were a bunch of free market economists, and so they would design these experiments to teach a certain lesson, a certain idea. They would also make it clear this isn't the totality of economic activities. One of one of the hard things it's hard to capture in a lesson or an experiment, is the fact of productivity. I mean, before anybody can sell anything, they got to have something to sell. You got to go be productive, right? Before someone can buy anything, you got to be productive and create some wealth. You got to have something to trade with someone else. And those, those sort of real hard life lessons are hard to capture in an experiment, because nobody's going to go build a factory inside a classroom.
Well, but that's why it's important to distinguish that all of those people were presumably productive. That you had the people producing energy.
Yes.
And if you had capital to begin with, you did something productive. The other part of that throws the wrench into all of this is different value, how people place different value on different things, and different tolerances for needs versus wants. Somebody might say, I'm comfortable at this temperature, at this lower temperature. I don't want to buy as much energy from you because I'm not looking to get as warm. Whereas my mom, who likes it really warm all the time, she's always cold.
Yep.
She's probably willing, it's of higher value to her to get more electricity, and she's willing to pay more. I mean, that's what makes an economy work.
That's right.
Is this different idea of what is valuable to different people.
Diversity, real diversity, right? Human diversity.
Right.
The fact that all of us are different in physical talents and intellectual talents, and we have all these different needs, and we value different things. That's what really makes economics possible. If we were all identical, if we all did the exact same thing, had the exact same talents, the exact same minds, right? Then there wouldn't be any differentiation of labor. But the fact that we have different talents and things makes all of this possible. Also, different markets, different kinds of products and services. People have vastly different expectations. An example: if you're going to go buy a bicycle, a person might do a fair amount of research, different kinds of bicycles, different places to buy bicycles, right? Pros and cons. You might put in quite a bit of time before you actually go buy your bicycle. Whereas if you flip on your light switch, you don't want to research and negotiate, right? You just want your light to come on right then. And so different kinds of markets have really different kinds of expectations.
Yes, but there is that variable even in the light switch. And I think this is a really important distinction. I can buy different kinds of light bulbs.
Yes.
And different kinds of light bulbs consume different amounts of electricity.
True.
And provide different kinds of light. I mean, we're in a studio right now.
Yep.
Right? We have above us, we have what are the halogen lights?
Yep.
Or
Fluorescent
lights.
Yeah.
We have fluorescent lights. Fluorescent lights have a certain cost. They also have a certain look to them. If we didn't have our camera lights on us as well, we'd probably look really washed out. We'd have these awful shadows on us.
I usually look washed out anyway, Dave, even with great lighting.
But there is this distinction. To create a valuable look in our podcast, it's worth spending the money on nicer lights.
Right.
In my house, I like certain kinds of lights versus other kinds of lights because for some, if it's a reading light, I think this is easier to read under. Or for some, if it's over a dinner table, it's easier to look at and have conversation over food. So you have all these differences.
Right. Well, and all those things, right? Before you can buy any light bulb, as I said, you have to produce something. You have to create some wealth, so you have something to trade. And I'm just going to cut right to the core here, Dave. Unless you're the Federal Reserve, you don't have to create any wealth at all to go buy something. If you're the Federal... Walk us through this, Dave. And we're going to bring this to the subject. There are all kinds of huge spending bills percolating in Congress right now, and they're all disastrous. But if you are the Federal Reserve, which is part of the government, this is a creation of the federal government. Congress created the Federal Reserve through a statutory law. If you're the Federal Reserve and you want to buy government bonds, which is to say, if you're the government and you want to buy your own bonds, right?
Yeah.
Do you have to be productive first? Do you have to create wealth? How do you buy it?
There's no productivity in the government. We've established this over many months, over years. There is supposed to be a wall, an imaginary wall.
Before we do the wall,
okay.
Can I just articulate that important thing you just said, just momentarily? When you said there's no productivity, government does not create wealth, that's not just an opinion you have about the kinds of people in government. You didn't say that because you think they're a bunch of lazy bureaucrats. You're saying that as a matter of fact, as a factual matter. To create wealth is to do something. It is an activity either of the mind or the body, using your hands, or some combination of both. You have to do something that someone else finds valuable.
And wants to buy.
And wants to buy. If you can make something with your hands, you can offer an idea that someone else doesn't. You can teach them something. You can show them, so you could perform. You could just let them see you do something. And if they find it valuable enough to buy, they'll trade, then you have created wealth for yourself by providing value for someone else. When you think of the three powers of government, legislative, executive, and judicial, and think through the activity involved in each. To exercise the legislative power is to pass laws.
Right.
And most laws are some form of thou shalt not.
Right.
Or thou shalt be punished if thou does these things. It's prohibitions and restrictions. And then the executive power is going out and it enforces those laws. It makes sure that people aren't doing things they're prohibited from doing. And if there's ever a question whether someone actually violated the law or not, the judicial power is used to judge, to render a judgment. Did the person actually violate the law or not? In all that activity, writing laws, enforcing laws, judging whether people violated laws, there's no value created. There's no wealth created. No houses get built, no medicines get invented, no crops get grown, no computers or made. None of the things that we value and we're willing to buy happens. No great baseball games or football games or basketball games happen. And so in that sense, government literally, quite literally, creates no wealth because it produces no marketable value to others. Which means if government is going to offer anything, if government wants, I don't know, I'm going to think of something just wildly crazy that could never actually be real. If government wanted to go plant trees in poor neighborhoods.
Can't be real, right?
Can't be real, right?
We'll get to that.
If they wanted to buy and plant trees, the government has to take money from somebody, somewhere, because it doesn't have trees. It doesn't have employees to plant trees. It has to spend money, so it's got to take money, take wealth from somebody somehow.
I'm going to suggest there's one exception to that rule.
Okay.
It's a big admission.
Yeah.
There is one situation where the government will use its money and its power to create productivity and wealth.
Okay.
And that's when it's cronyism, right?
Right.
And I'm not saying this is good.
Yeah.
I'm just saying they are creating wealth for somebody else.
Yeah.
Right? When they say, we've got a pandemic. Hey, Pfizer, we're going to give you a bunch of money. We're going to take a bunch of taxpayer money, and we're going to expect you to go make a vaccine.
Yeah.
And we're going to pay you for the vaccine, or we're going to expect citizens to pay you for the vaccine.
Yeah.
And we're going to force citizens to get it. Well, they created wealth. Pfizer created something for some price. They charged everybody more for it. Pfizer, and we've seen this through a lot of different emergencies.
Yeah.
For those listening, and I'm realizing we have a lot more people who listen to this than watch it than I realized.
Yeah.
I'm putting that in air quotes, right? When we have emergencies, they will go out and they will create wealth for their crony friends.
Yeah. Well, they still have to take. To do anything, they have to take.
Yes.
Here's the other thing government can do. Government can provide a kind of value in a really perverse way, in a way that only government can. When it comes to free citizens, the only way that I can create wealth for myself relative to you as another free human being is to try to do something you value.
Yep.
And you are always free to say, I'm not interested. I don't want to trade.
You can't command me with the power of force and law.
But a government can come and put the squeeze on everybody. Regulate, control, squeeze, restrict, prohibit.
Right.
And then it becomes valuable for some people to say, hey, government, if I pay you some money, if I slip you some money on the table, will you loosen up the squeeze that you have? Will you not enforce those regulations on my business so much? In fact, if I pay you more money, will you go enforce those regulations on my competitor down the street, right? And let me just do things freely. And so it's a way of creating value by people by first hurting them and then seeing who's it worth to try to loosen the grip of government.
Or we're going to tighten the government grip on everybody because we know certain people can afford to manage those regulations, that compliance that we've talked about in the past. And the best example, and this still gets me, I scream at my TV like once every 15 minutes.
Yeah.
I just scream the word no. There's this constant Facebook commercial. We've talked about this in the past, but now the Facebook commercial has been 25 years ago, the government created regulations on the internet. What's happened to the internet in 25 years? And it shows this like fast moving highlight reel of all the evolution and growth and improvement and everything else of the government. And they say, don't you think it's time we have updated internet regulations? And I just shout, no. So the government, we can generally agree, the government itself creates absolutely nothing productive. They create nothing of value that I want to go buy. Right? There's nothing out there that says, I want to go.
So when the Fed, and I'm mentioning this because we're going to talk here a little bit about all this debt that we have unprecedented, historic,
nearly $30 trillion.
Almost $30 trillion. And we're about to spend a whole lot more. Democrats in Congress and the President of the United States want to, the only thing they're disagreeing with each other on is how many trillions of dollars of other people's money that they're going to spend.
Right.
And we need to talk about that. But a lot of that debt is funded by the sale of government bonds, federal government bonds, treasury bonds. And who buys most of those bonds? Why, it's none other than the government.
Right.
The government buys government bonds. But if the government hasn't produced anything, how is it that government can buy government bonds? So just walk us through that process.
Okay, so a bond typically is issued by a government entity, whether it's the federal government, whether it's a state government, whether it's a municipal government. They offer a bond and they say, let's say the bond is $100. Let's say they're trying to raise $100 million.
Okay.
You can go into your local bank or other places and you can buy that bond. You'll buy a bond.
It's actually a piece of paper, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. You'll buy a bond, a piece of paper that they say is going to have this interest rate. So at that interest rate at the moment you buy it, your bond for $100, let's say you buy a $100 bond, you can cash in that bond. They tell you you have to hold it for 10 years. In 10 years, you can cash that bond for $110 or $120.
10 or 20% interest.
And in actuality, they do it in the reverse way. You buy a $100 bond and you pay $80 for it.
Right.
Right. So you say, I want a bond that in 10 years will be worth $100. So they say, okay, the cost for that is $80.
Right.
And if I decide to cash it in early, I get less than the value of the bond and so on and so forth.
$85 or $90. If you wait the whole time, you get your $100.
And this was a way for, we talked last week in the podcast and in this month's case study, we talked about the idea of using a GoFundMe style approach to funding the government.
Right.
And in a way, and I'll clarify a difference, but in a way that's what bonds are, right? The only difference is when you're buying a municipal bond, they say it's generally for schooling and general purposes. They never say, I'm using that as an example.
Yeah.
They never say, we need to sell a bond to put new toilets into every high school in the country. They say, we need a bond for education. We need a bond, and it'll usually say education and other general purposes.
Yeah.
And that way they can really use that money
rarely in like small communities. They might float a bond for a very specific purpose, but it's unusual. A new football field, right? And so they might do something really specific, but that's rare.
Right.
That's the exception.
So and that would be the closest thing to the GoFundMe approach.
Yes.
Here's where we got all...
Because that means, individuals could choose.
Right.
The government say, we want to build a new football field for the local public high school, and it costs, I have no idea how much a football field costs.
For a high school, a couple $100,000.
$200,000, and we don't have the $200,000. And rather than raising your taxes, we're going to try to raise the money through these bonds. And then we'll issue these bonds, and citizens can choose if they want to buy them or not. It is a kind of GoFundMe.
So that's where it started.
Yeah.
And then the government started saying, well, we're not getting enough money. Not enough people want the things they should want, right? Not enough people are willing to pay for the things they should want to pay for.
Yeah.
So the next evolution was, we're going to start putting bond issues on the ballot, where it says, we're putting a bond forward.
Yep.
Do the majority of people in your neighborhood believe that we should all have to pay this bond? And that's what they would do. We need this much money. It is called a tax, but they're selling them as bonds, and they're saying we're gonna refund you eventually someday. Never actually happens, but we're gonna refund you someday. They put a bond issue. Will you force your neighbor
to buy
who
this
doesn't
thing?
want to? Right? Think about schools today. How many people have said, I want nothing to do with the public schools. I'm going the charter route. I'm going the private route. I'm going the homeschooling route. But the public school needs a football stadium. So you who don't like the schools, we're going to issue a bond, and you're going to have to pay for it if the majority want it.
This subject is very pronounced in my hometown. I'm from a small town in western Kansas, and there are precisely 2 high schools. There is the local public high school, and there's a private Catholic prep school. So what that means is the Catholic school is smaller. I don't know, 30, 40 years ago, they were pretty close in size.
Okay.
So you have these 2 public schools within one little town. And when they want to raise money for the high school, for anything for the high school, what do? They either raise the taxes or they float these bonds that get passed that everybody has to buy. And so the family sending their kid to the Catholic school, they're sitting there looking at this thinking, well, wait a minute. We pay tuition at this school because this is how we're handling the education of our children. Why are you taking money from me against my will for that other school that I want nothing to do with?
Right. And that's usually on a very local, right? Whether it's a municipal, a county, even a neighborhood type level.
Right.
Then you have these U.S. federal bonds, these government bonds that the government is issuing to raise capital, right? So we talked all last week about raising the debt ceiling. And when you're raising the debt ceiling, you're saying, okay, we're willing to raise the federal deficit. The federal debt is going to go from 28 trillion. That's a big difference. 28 trillion to 30 trillion or to 35 trillion. We're willing to take on more debt. And they're going to go issue all of these other bonds.
More bonds. So for our listeners who don't, I have a hunch, some of our listeners right now are thinking this is so basic. Some of them are probably thinking, Dave and Tom are just, they're messing this all up. They could make this simpler. But there are some other listeners who don't think about these things very often. And this is very foreign. So I want to make real clear, a bond is debt for the government. They owe somebody the amount of that bond.
Right. That's where some of our federal national debt comes from. So you have these bonds and you say, okay, we're going to go issue these bonds. And this is something that it took me a while to learn, probably even after college. The number of people in the financial services industry, right? We think of people in the financial services industry as those who help you get into stocks and different things like that. There are people in the financial services industry whose sole job is to sell bonds. I know somebody whose sole job is to sell municipal bonds, and he'll sell them to anybody in the country. So he'll go out and he'll look for, well, this bond is offering a really good return. I'm going to go find people who are willing to part with some cash for a while because look at how big the return is going to get, and I can make their retirement a little more secure by selling them $1 million worth of this municipal bond where the city of Cleveland is really willing to pay a high interest rate on it, right? And there's a whole industry built around that. I know some people who have done very, very well just selling those
bonds,
selling municipal bonds, and those are things to pay for like new sewer systems or new schools or whatever else to somebody who has nothing to do with that. But at least they're making the choice. That's the GoFundMe model. So we've talked about this national debt and we've talked about these federal bonds. What happens when when not enough people say, well, all right, I'm interested in that. I will buy that bond with that guaranteed return.
When not enough people.
When not enough people.
Right.
And let's talk about why people would want to. One is, what if the market is really good?
Yeah.
Right? What if I could put my money in the stock market in a very conservative portfolio that focuses heavily on the Dow Industrial Average, the Dow 30, and all of a sudden I might get 5% a year on my money, whereas that bond might only pay me 3% over 10 years.
Right.
So,
or sink your money into real estate, hoping the real estate market will go up and make more money, right? All kinds of ways you could invest in maybe
and now
make
what's
more
the
money.
big one? Cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there are people who bought 10 years ago cryptocurrencies for 71 cents a bit per Bitcoin.
Right.
And those are worth $44,000 a coin today.
Right.
So if you're willing to be a little more volatile and in a little more risk, you might want to put your money there. So there's a lot of reasons that the government can't sell the bonds to enough people. There's not enough interest. But the government just said, well, we just agreed to raise the debt, and we just passed a bill that we have to pay for all of these things.
I hear Miss Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she goes on national TV and she'll talk about how they in Congress are going to pay for it. They don't mean they're going to write out a check from their personal checking accounts for these trillions of dollars. When she says they're going to pay for it, where do they go?
Well, they come to the taxpayers. They come and they tax us. And the truth is, the tax dollars never end up covering the amount, right? And that's how we get debt. So they can only tax us a certain amount. You talk in this month's case study about the Laffer curve and that stuff. There's a line in which the tax revenue starts to decrease. People become less productive when they have to give more money to the government in taxes. They have less incentive to be productive.
My friends, James Harrigan and Anthony Davies, they've done some research and found over the last 75 years, since FDR and the New Deal, and we're talking a period of time here where the income tax rate shot up from the 70s to the 90s, slowly came back down to the 80s and 70s, then with Ronald Reagan, dropped it way down to, I think 28% was the top marginal rate when Reagan left. The point is, it's been really high, much lower, and throughout all those decades, when you look at the actual percent of total productivity, the GDP, of what the United States Treasury collects in income taxes, it turns out to be around 18%, 19%. That's about the number productive Americans are willing to let the government
percentage
take.
Of GDP.
Yeah,
So
total productivity. How much of that does the government actually take? It doesn't really matter what the income tax level, because when you raise the income tax level really high, those people who are getting hit at those high levels, they come up with all kinds of ways to shield their wealth from the taxes.
And there's also the whole idea of corporate income taxes.
Yes.
Which I would love to come back to if we have the time.
Yeah.
But to finish this whole conversation, when the government has these bonds that they want to issue and they can't find enough people to buy it, they go to the Federal Reserve, who is supposed to be separate from the actual executive, legislative branches of the government, judicial too, but the judicial's another body entirely. The executive and the executive and the legislature, where a lot of the money is spent.
Right.
There's supposed to be this thing, the Federal Reserve, who operates independently. Right. Supposedly. Operates independently of them, and they control interest rates. They define what is the par interest rate, the basis. But what the Federal Reserve does also is it controls the mints, and it controls how much money is printed.
Yep.
So if we're controlling how much money is printed, the Federal Reserve can say, well, Congress just approved us to increase the debt ceiling. They have allowed us to create more debt.
I just want to point out how laughable this idea of the wall is. The Federal Reserve can only buy more bonds. They can only lift its debt ceiling if Congress approves it.
Right.
Which just gives the lie to this whole idea that there's some big wall separating these two things.
Absolutely.
The Federal Reserve is a creature of Congress.
Sure. Sure.
There's no wall separating it
and
from
the
government.
Federal Reserve, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and all of the presidents of all they have these regional Fed presidents.
Yeah.
All of these presidents have to be approved by the government,
Right.
by the elected officials as well,
Yes.
and they can be removed. So their whole purpose is to try to keep them happy so they can stay in their job. Right. Jay Powell has survived multiple presidents and we've had different people. Janet Yellen was the Federal Reserve chairman. Now she's the head of the Treasury. She's the Secretary of the Treasury. Right. So there's a lot of it's incestuous.
Yes.
So I actually just heard this stat this week, and this was a new one for me. The Federal Reserve can buy the bonds that the government needs that they can't sell to anybody else. Everybody else says there's not enough value in that bond for me to buy it. So then the government turns to the Federal Reserve and says, okay, we were only able to sell this many. So will you buy the rest? Well, the Federal Reserve isn't productive. The Federal Reserve doesn't actually make any money.
So how does it buy bonds?
It prints money. It goes to the mints and says, let's print up money to give cash to Congress and the president and the bureaus. And we will take those bonds and they'll pay us back eventually. Right? I heard a stat just this week, first time I've ever heard this stat. Currently, the Federal Reserve holds 57% of the bonds issued by the federal government. Right? So 57% of the bonds.
More than half. The majority, a large majority.
You know how much money that is? How much money that equates to? Over $10 trillion.
Yeah.
$10 trillion has been printed. Now, what does that do? Inflation.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So when more money is printed, we all understand, I hope, basic supply and demand. I talked about supply and demand at the casino at the beginning. Basic supply and demand. As supply of money goes up, then the value of it goes down.
Right.
I need more money, which is why.
Another way to think about it is as the Fed prints money, there is out there more dollars. They print more money, but that doesn't mean there are more houses being built or more cars being produced, right? Or more corn being grown. So there's the same amount of productivity, but now more dollar bills in the system chasing after those, which means everything becomes more expensive.
And you know what else happens? And this is a sort of a conversation we can have for another time. But the government, this goes back, we talked months and months and months ago about Milton Friedman's 4 quadrants of spending money.
Yeah.
When you're spending other people's money on other people, you don't care about how much you're spending.
That's right. You also don't care about the quality of whatever it is that you're spending it on.
So you joked earlier about spending about the planting of trees.
Right.
And for those who don't know, in this new infrastructure bill, again, I'm using air quotes.
Yeah.
In this new infrastructure bill, there is $3 billion dedicated to what they're calling tree equity. I can't even believe I just said those words. Tree equity. It means that there are people in poor neighborhoods in the United States who don't have as many trees in their neighborhood as people in wealthy neighborhoods. So we're going to spend $3 billion of taxpayer dollars, or when you don't have enough taxpayer dollars, of Fed printed money on planting trees in those neighborhoods. So what happens is the federal government just says, well, I don't really care about the cost of the trees. I just want to plant as many as I can. So just somebody go do it, right? I'm gonna call some company. Hey, here's $3 billion. Just go make these neighborhoods look pretty.
Actually, let me qualify that. They don't just call somebody.
They call their friends.
That they call a company and they say, "Will you put Hunter Biden on your payroll? Then we'll contract with you to go plant these. And you just make sure you pay him $50,000 a month.
And you make sure you kick back some of that $3 billion. Better go to my campaign reelection fund.
That whole world of contracting services. You know, you have this big unconstitutional spending bills that requires thousands of contractors to provide all these services is just a breeding ground for that kind of crony corruption.
So what happens then? So you give money to, you're paying this company, but you have to pay them more because they have to have some extra capital to pay Hunter Biden.
That's right.
They have to have some extra capital to pay your campaign fund.
Right.
And all of a sudden that tree that might have cost
$100 at Home Depot,
$100 at Home Depot
is now $10,000.
Right.
Yes.
Then all the other companies are saying, well, they're selling trees for $10,000. Why
Yeah.
shouldn't we? And so if you and I want to go plant a tree in our front yard,
Right.
it becomes a whole lot more expensive, which
Yep.
is why we've seen the price of wood shoot up, why we've seen the price of food skyrocket. All of these things are happening because of all of these payouts going to.
I tell you, Dave, I'm genuinely worried. We're entering a really bad situation here. I fear that we have skyrocketing inflation right around the corner, and that is coupled with the fact that we're not being productive. We have a whole lot of people who are still sitting at home and they're not working, and we have all kinds of disruptions in supply lines in all kinds of industries because everything has been shut down. And so what happens when simultaneously you have inflation comes roaring in and price of, the basic things like eggs and bread and milk and things that people need, gasoline, other things, the price doubles, triples, quadruples really quickly, and there's not enough of everything within an unsubsidized, unregulated free market situation, which is the free market is just a synonym for free people. Where there are free people securing their property, you have a free market. Within a free market, the way you get lower prices and better quality is competition and increased production. More people produce more things, and as one person's producing something, someone else comes along and says, I can do that better. I can make another one of these, and multiply that by millions of times, and you get better quality and lower prices. We're going in the opposite direction. Lower productivity, which in itself would drive prices up. Then you're going to have the phenomenon of inflation added on top of that. And we're heading into scary space here. And at this very moment, we have Democrats in Congress talking about, they have 2 spending bills right now. One is $1 trillion, and they call it infrastructure.
Right.
Yet roads and bridges, and that's what most people think of as infrastructure, is only a piece of it. It's all this other kind of crony favoritism. They have another bill for $3.5 trillion, and there's pressure inside among congressional Democrats. There are some saying this is a huge mistake. It's not big enough.
Right.
This shouldn't be $3.5 trillion. This should be $5 trillion or
6,
7,
7
or 8.
or 8.
Yeah, absolutely. And how does all this get paid? If they're selling their own bonds, Congress is selling bonds to the Fed, which is, look, I want to be real clear. This is government selling bonds to itself.
Yep.
That's what it really is. It's a shell game for accountants to take these bonds over to the Federal Reserve, and then the Federal Reserve prints out some money and hands that back. Congress might as well be printing the money itself and saying, this is how we're going to pay for stuff. I want our listeners to think about that on an individual basis. If someone offered to buy your car from you and they came and they said, well, here's what I'm going to do. I got this printer right here and it prints Tom bills. So I'm going to print out whatever you want for your car. I'm going to print out that much in Tom Cranwitter bills and hand it to you. I printed my own money, right? That would be laughable to you. You wouldn't do that ever.
Right.
And yet that's exactly what our federal government is doing.
So you talked about it that way, and we then start thinking about, you have the left making these huge comments about minimum wages, right? Livable wage. It's why this idea of creating a minimum wage, a livable wage, as they like to put it, is actually impossible. Because the more you increase those prices, and the more they borrow and the more inflation we have, in order to create those prices, people are going to, the companies are going to have to take out more debt to pay their employees. And you take up more debt. That debt is basically printed from the Federal Reserve. Every inflation goes up. People can afford to buy more, so they keep raising the prices. And you're always playing this game of chase.
Yes. Always trying to catch up.
And that what they call now a $15 minimum wage will do the same thing that $5 did. We'll get you the same amount that $5 did before, and then you raise it to $25, and it'll get you the same amount that $5 did 2 rounds ago, and it's just a constant game of chase.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and it's a bad space. And look, I mean, we know this from theory, and we know this from practice, from history. Inflation can lead to disastrous results. It's a big part of the you and I were talking just before we started recording, is a big part of the collapse of the Soviet Union. Inflation brought down something as gigantic and as massive and as powerful as the Soviet Union. I'm a scholar of the Civil War. The Confederate States of America decided to fund a lot of its debt through printing money, and the economy of the South just collapses. I mean, this used to be 2-3 generations ago. This was a running joke in America. If something was worthless, they would say it's as worthless as a Confederate dollar bill because you couldn't. It was worthless. It didn't mean anything. The country of Zimbabwe famously had this role of they were printing money like it was going out of style, and inflation went so high you had to use a wheelbarrow full of cash to go buy a loaf of bread. So their response was to start printing dollars in bigger units. And so you can go, I think you can still buy these. You can find a Zimbabwean, it's either a 10 trillion or $100 trillion bill. That's how worthless their currency became. And that leads to, this isn't just economics and mathematics and numbers and data that's going to appear on a chart. What this translates into, these are real people who lose their homes and lose their jobs and can't eat and can't get anything that they need, can't provide for their children. This kind of total economic collapse leads to terrible, miserable human suffering. If we look at human prosperity and flourishing on one end of the spectrum, what we're talking about here is the other end of the spectrum, and it involves a lot of human pain.
Let's try to, as simply as I can, let's talk about what that process, just very straightforward, how that ends up happening.
Yeah.
So we just talked about $10 trillion of our debt is in government bonds to the Fed.
So about a third. Just so our listeners know, we're getting close to $30 trillion. We're not quite there, but we're going to be there real soon.
About a third.
$30 trillion the United States government owes to other people, and a third of that it owes allegedly to itself.
Now, you know where about another quarter of it comes from? Foreign debt. Money we're borrowing from other countries, specifically Japan and China. And we talked about that last week. Over $1 trillion to both of those countries, 1.228 to Japan and just over $1 trillion to China. So we rely on foreign lending just as much. And foreign lending happens because they believe that those dollars are still going to be worth something, that our currency is stable. If we continue to print too much money, they see inflation happening, they become less likely to lend us money. If we insist on continuing to spend and that foreign investment refuses to come through. Now, I should have looked up before we started, but I would love to go back and see a chart of where that foreign lending versus printing line was.
Right.
I bet it's reversed in the last 25 years.
Right.
I'd go back to 92, maybe 90. But that trend of printing our own money to buy government bonds versus foreign investment. Because foreign investment, those countries then have an investment in our economy staying strong.
Right.
If they don't believe our economy can stay strong, they will stop lending. If our government continues to spend, they will start printing more, and that difference becomes even greater. The more we print, the less our dollars become worth, and that's when people like you and I and everyone else in the United States stops being able to afford a loaf of bread.
And ultimately, this phenomenon of inflation, which is economists will say this is a monetary phenomenon, meaning it is something experienced that happens because of the printing of money. Inflation is ultimately a form of theft. It's a form of theft, and in a way, it's the most deceitful. It's a cowardly kind of theft. It's worse than a mugger, because at least a mugger has the courage, right, to confront you in person and threaten you and say, give me the money in your wallet. Inflation is so subtle you don't notice it. So for those of our listeners right now, you've saved up some money in you have a savings account, or you have some savings somewhere, and you think that's great. You have a plan for that money. Maybe you're going to retire on it, or maybe you're going to use that money to buy a house or something, send your kids to college. And what happens with inflation is your dollars sit there in your bank account. They don't change. But what does change is the value of those dollars. Maybe you save $100,000, and then inflation hits, and all of a sudden, all that money is only worth $1,000. You can't buy anything with it.
Let me put that in a different term.
Yeah.
Instead of talking about the value of it,
Yeah.
the purchasing power of it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes. Excellent. Yes.
The purchasing power of that dollar changes.
Yes.
There was a time where you could go buy a loaf of bread for a quarter.
Right.
And today, if you go buy a loaf of bread, you're looking at $2.50.
Right.
The purchasing power of that dollar
Good
has
distinction.
inflated to the point where it takes 10 times as much money
Right.
to buy that loaf of bread as it did before because there's more dollars in circulation. And obviously, I will recognize there is a higher demand, right? There's more people. So there's a higher demand for that bread, and there's only so much that can be produced. Now, where the government really screws us up is they put all these regulations out there to prevent other companies from coming in, other people from coming in. You can't just bake a loaf of bread and go out on your front step and sell it to people.
Yeah, you're right. These things are intrinsically connected, and I want to try to just distill this down as we wrap up, because this can be kind of heady and confusing sometimes. But all this is true. On the one hand, I want to make clear, we're not saying that prices go up only because of inflation. That's not true. Within a realm of freedom, free markets, prices can go up. They do go up when demand goes up faster than the supply. And the opposite is true. When the supply goes up faster, when more and more people start producing things and the demand either stays the same or maybe even drops off, prices go down. More of the stuff available. This happened to many farm markets in the 1930s and the 1940s. We got better at farming. Farmers got really productive, and they were producing more wheat and corn and these sorts of things. And yet there were about the same number of mouths in the world to feed, and so the price of crops went down. Inflation drives up prices in a way that has nothing to do with demand.
Right.
It drives it up because it is devaluing the purchasing power of every dollar, which is the form of theft. It's basically taking away what you can purchase with the dollars that you have in your savings account or your checking account. And then when we think about within a realm of freedom, if prices are going up because demand is going up, which is a very natural thing that happens, usually the response of free people, some will watch what's going on. And if prices are going up on any kind of good, whether it's bread or houses or cars, entrepreneurial people say, hey, I'm going to go jump in. I'm going to start baking bread or building cars or building houses because I can make money in that industry. And yet we've created so many regulations. It is more difficult now in the United States than ever before to go start a business.
Right. So I want to close with, to anybody who's seeing the media play this scare game of any congressman who is fighting against raising the debt ceiling, and they are trying to terrify the United States. I mean, I have heard all of the reports. If we don't raise our debt ceiling, Janet Yellen, Director of the Treasury, Secretary of the Treasury, said today, October 18th is our deadline. If we don't raise the debt ceiling by October 18th, we are going to default on our loans, and nobody's going to be willing to borrow from us ever again.
Right.
Or lend to us. Foreign investment will never happen. The credit rating is going to take a hit. For all of those listening to those scare tactics, there's that other side of the story. What we just presented is the other side of the story of what happens if we do raise the debt ceiling.
That's right.
And until we can get spending under control and government only spends what the United States citizens are willing to give it, we are always going to have this problem. There are some people who are standing tall in Congress, and to an extent, I applaud them.
So the most practical first takeaway from all of this, this whole big subject is those in government, the first best thing to do, spend less money.
Yes.
Stop spending so much money. Don't give us any more $3.5 trillion bills. Cut down on how much you're spending. Maybe get rid of some government employees, get rid of some government contractors, and encourage those people to go out in the world and be productive.
Right.
Like all other Americans are.
Right. So, there's so much more to say on this. Maybe we'll pick it up again next week, but continue to stand strong. And for anybody who tells you, well, we've got to spend all this money, now you have the argument for the other side.
That's right. Until then, we're going to keep guarding the principles of the American founding.
No somos custodes.